Okay, so we're diving straight in today to something that honestly feels pretty significant.
It does.
It feels like less of a typical political back and forth and more like something that could actually shake up how we think about free speech in the media.
Right. And, we've been looking into a bunch of commentary, and frankly, some of it is pretty concerning.
Yeah.
Surrounding this whole thing with the federal official.
Yeah.
And some remarks that he made about Disney's broadcast licenses.
Yeah, and what makes this particular situation so interesting is that it's not even about the usual things that the FCC, looks into.
Right. It's not about indecency or, spreading misinformation. That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's totally different.
This time we're looking at a major media company, Disney,
Mm.
and specifically whether their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Yeah.
often referred to as DEI, that whole thing,
DEI, yeah.
could actually put their ABC broadcast licenses at risk.
Yeah, and I think it's important right off the bat to say that this isn't just about one company.
No, it's much bigger than that.
This is about, what values are considered okay in our media landscape,
For sure.
and ultimately who gets to have a voice.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's get down to it. The person who's really brought this whole thing into the spotlight is Brendan Carr.
Right.
He's a Republican commissioner at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. And he's the one who's publicly questioned whether Disney should even be allowed to keep its licenses for ABC.
That's right.
And the main reason he's giving is because of their company-wide DEI initiatives.
Yep.
So that's what we're going to unpack today.
Sounds good.
So, as you're listening to all this, keep in mind that this goes way beyond just Disney.
It does.
This is about the bigger picture of media in this country.
Totally.
So let's start with Carr's argument.
Okay.
What exactly is he saying?
So his main point is that Disney and ABC's DEI programs are actually a form of what he calls viewpoint discrimination. Essentially what he's suggesting is that these initiatives, in trying to promote representation,
Right.
they actually end up marginalizing or excluding people who don't fit into that specific viewpoint that he believes DEI promotes.
Okay, so hold on a sec.
Yeah.
So a company that's actively trying to be more inclusive is somehow being exclusive when it comes to viewpoints.
Well, that's the argument that's being put forward.
That feels kind of paradoxical.
It is a bit of a head scratcher, right?
Yeah, it is
You're trying to be inclusive, but then you're being accused of excluding certain viewpoints.
Right, and it really highlights this fundamental disagreement
It does.
about what even is fairness and equal opportunity when it comes to the media.
Huge question.
So can you break down what exactly viewpoint discrimination means in this specific context? How is Commissioner Carr using that term?
Sure. So as he sees it, DEI policies, even though they're meant to address, historical underrepresentation and all that, could end up creating an environment where certain perspectives are less valued or even actively discouraged.
Okay.
So the worry is that in trying to make things more diverse and equitable in the workplace and in the content they produce,
Right.
other viewpoints might get suppressed, whether it's intentional or not.
I see.
And that leads to a skewed representation of ideas.
Okay, so here's where things get even more interesting
Okay.
and where I see a strong counter-argument coming up.
Yeah.
Isn't it a bit of an overreach for a government regulator to even think about using their power?
Like the FCC's power?
Right, exactly. To potentially punish a private company for their values, especially when those values are all about diversity and inclusion.
Right.
I mean, that feels a lot like using the power of the government
He does.
to force a very specific viewpoint on what's okay for a company to believe in.
Yeah, and that's what critics are saying too.
Right.
They're arguing that Carr's suggestion could basically be seen as trying to use government authority to dictate what a private media company can and can't stand for internally.
Right.
And they point out the irony of it all, using this idea of fairness to potentially silence the very voices advocating for DEI and representing marginalized communities.
Yeah.
It's
a bit backwards.
It is. It really makes you question, what are the limits of a government regulator?
Absolutely.
When it comes to meddling in the internal stuff of a media company.
Huge question.
Yeah, so this whole thing really brings into focus the FCC's role.
Totally.
We're talking about a big difference between like legitimate regulation
Right.
that's in the public interest, like making sure broadcast signals don't interfere with each other,
Right.
or that broadcasters are being responsible with what they put out there.
Like basic stuff.
Basic stuff versus what some people are calling potential retaliation
Yeah.
against a company just for their values.
Because they said, we believe in diversity and inclusion.
Right. And the idea that that commitment to DEI could actually be a reason to take away their license.
Heavy.
I mean, one of the sources we were looking at called it a culture war weapon.
Ooh, that's a strong phrase.
That is a very strong phrase. So what does that even mean? Well, it suggests that the FCC could move beyond its usual duties.
Yeah.
And become a tool in these broader ideological battles.
Right.
So instead of focusing on technical standards or protecting consumers,
Mm-hmm.
they could start putting pressure on media companies
Oh, wow.
based on their social or political views, what their internal policies say, and the content they produce.
So it's like they're taking sides in the culture war.
Kind of, yeah. It's a slippery slope for sure.
Okay, so for everyone listening, it's super important to understand what the long-term effects of this kind of approach could be.
Definitely.
And our sources keep talking about this dangerous precedent that it sets.
Right.
So can you paint a picture of what that could look like down the road?
All right, so let's say a network really wants to hire a more diverse team of writers, producers, on-air talent,
Mm-hmm.
So their staff reflects the actual demographics of the country.
Makes sense.
Or let's say a streaming service decides to focus on showcasing stories from creators with underrepresented backgrounds. Or even just a media company that implements training programs to help their employees understand unconscious bias.
Yeah.
So if this logic that Carr's putting forward takes hold,
Mm-hmm.
could those actions actually be interpreted as ideological exclusion?
Wow.
As in they're favoring certain groups over others,
Right.
and therefore that could be grounds for challenging their license in the future.
That's kind of scary.
It is a bit. It's like the whole idea of trying to make the media more equitable and representative
Yeah.
gets flipped on its head.
Right, and we're seeing this whole concept of DEI,
Yeah.
which became such a big focus after 2020.
After everything that happened.
Exactly. It was seen as a response to all these societal inequalities.
Right. People were saying this is important.
Right. It's the right thing to do.
It's morally right. It's good for business.
Right.
But now we're seeing it portrayed as a negative thing,
Yeah.
even a threat in some cases.
Yeah. And our sources are pointing to what they see as a deliberate campaign.
A coordinated effort.
Yeah. To reframe how we think about DEI.
It's fascinating how quickly public perception can shift.
It really is.
Things that were once widely supported,
Seen as a good thing.
totally ethically sound, maybe even beneficial for businesses.
Right. Connect with a wider audience.
Exactly. But now they're being presented as inherently divisive and discriminatory.
Wow.
And the argument usually boils down to this idea that focusing on group identities and historical disparities
Mhm.
inevitably leads to unfair treatment of individuals who don't belong to those groups.
It's like they're saying that trying to fix past wrongs is now creating new wrongs.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure.
It is, but here's what I think is really important to highlight.
Okay.
Our sources are very clear on this.
Lead on me.
Disney hasn't actually been accused of violating any broadcast regulations.
So they're not breaking any rules.
Nope. ABC isn't preventing any opposing viewpoints from being aired.
It's interesting.
Right. They're not failing to provide equal airtime or broadcasting illegal content or anything like that. The issue, as Commissioner Carr is framing it, is simply that he doesn't like their DEI policies.
Just the fact that they exist.
Yeah, and that they're putting them into practice.
So it's not about their actions, it's about their beliefs.
Right, it's about their stated values.
Wow.
And to me, that's a huge distinction.
It is, because it means that they're not actually doing anything wrong according to the rules.
Exactly.
But they're being targeted for what they believe in.
Right.
That's a significant shift in how the FCC's power could be used.
It really is. So let's think about the bigger picture.
Okay.
What happens if this line of thinking actually gains traction?
Uh-oh.
What could the consequences be for the entire media landscape?
Yeah, our sources are worried about a chilling effect.
What does that mean, practically speaking?
So imagine you're a media company,
Okay.
and you know that when your license comes up for renewal,
Mm-hmm.
the FCC might scrutinize your DEI efforts and see them as proof of viewpoint discrimination.
Yikes.
Suddenly, you might be less enthusiastic about investing in diverse content or hiring people from underrepresented communities.
It's risky.
Or even doing diversity training.
Yeah, because you might lose your license.
Think about it. If producing a documentary about LGBTQ plus history
Mm-hmm.
or having discussions about racial inequality on air
Right.
could be seen as ideologically biased and put your license at risk.
Yeah.
Many companies might just play it safe.
Right. Just stick to what they know won't cause trouble.
Exactly. They'll go for the most generic, harmless content.
To avoid any controversy.
Right. And that means less representation, less diversity of viewpoints.
So basically, this could make the media even less reflective of the actual diversity of our society.
That's the concern.
And it feels like it shifts the priorities of media companies
It does.
away from serving the public
Yeah.
and towards avoiding political scrutiny.
It becomes all about self-preservation.
Right. And that brings us to a really fundamental question about power.
Okay, I'm listening.
Our sources touch on this idea of who gets to tell the stories that shape our understanding of the world.
That's a big one.
Yeah. Who controls the microphone?
And whose stories get told.
Exactly. And I think that's really what this whole issue boils down to.
It's about power dynamics and representation in the media.
Right. DEI initiatives, even though they're not perfect.
They have their flaws, for sure.
They do, but their goal is to make sure more voices are heard.
To broaden the perspectives that we see and hear.
Exactly. And by potentially punishing companies for trying to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like saying that power should stay concentrated in the hands of those who already have it.
The people who have always controlled the narrative.
Right. And that brings us back to the FCC itself.
Okay.
I mean, the whole reason it was created was to act in the public interest.
Right. To make sure the airwaves, which belong to all of us,
Exactly, are used in a way that benefits everyone.
that's the goal.
So how does using the FCC as a tool to push a specific ideology?
Like an ideological gatekeeper.
Yeah. How does that fit with its original mission?
It's a tough question. There's definitely tension there.
Right. The traditional view of the FCC.
Is that it's supposed to ensure fair access to information, prevent media monopolies, regulate the technical stuff.
The nuts and bolts.
Exactly. But using it to promote a specific viewpoint on social issues.
Right. Or to target companies based on their values.
That's a huge departure from that original mission.
It is, and it raises concerns about the politicization of these regulatory bodies.
Right. So to sum this all up for you, the listener,
Yeah, bring it home.
we're looking at a situation where a federal official is suggesting that a media company's commitment to diversity and inclusion could be a reason for the government to take away their broadcast licenses.
Just for trying to be more inclusive.
And remember, this isn't about them breaking any laws or spreading misinformation. It's about a disagreement with their values, with their internal policies.
Wow. So just for believing in DEI.
And the potential consequences of this are huge.
Yeah, it could have a ripple effect across the entire media industry.
Right, companies might be afraid to prioritize diversity.
Out of fear of political backlash? Exactly, and ultimately it comes down to this question of who gets to tell their stories.
Whose voices get amplified?
Whose perspective shapes our understanding of the world?
Big questions.
So here's the final thought I'll leave you with.
All right.
If this idea that inclusion is discrimination gains traction,
Scary thought.
what kind of media landscape are we going to end up with?
Who gets silenced?
Whose stories disappear?
Yeah. What happens to the diversity of information and entertainment?
What happens to representation?
Especially in a society that claims to value different voices and perspectives.
Right, it's something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
See you next time.
Until then.